Good morning, and thank you for joining ABNY and our special guests for this morning's presentation, Let the Voters Decide. We are going to be talking about landmark ballot proposals aimed really at three or four specific proposals in two very important areas. So many of you know that there will be 4 ballot questions up for a vote in November, right? And what is a ballot measure? What does that mean? So basically, a ballot measure is a law, an issue, or a question that appears on the ballot for voters in each jurisdiction. So it's really an opportunity for voters to have direct action in lawmaking. And these 4 specific ballot proposals for November, if enacted, would boost spending for environmental projects, define how the city calculates the cost of living, and create a new racial equity office. And specifically, these 4 ballots are number 1, which is the Environmental Bond Act of 2022, and you'll hear more about that in detail. Proposal 2 is the Statement of Values for City Government, really important. You guys will hear more about that in a minute as well. Proposal 3 is the Racial Equity Plans and an Office. And Proposal 4 is True Cost of Living. Now, what does this mean? There will be more than just candidates on the ballot in November, right? That's what we're talking about. And we must do all that we can to educate the electorate about this law-making process and encourage New Yorkers to vote. Now, we know New York City has historically had low turnout in all elections, despite the high levels of registered New York City residents, right? So when we talk about the power of the vote, this puts the power of lawmaking directly in the hands of the public. So we have some really phenomenal speakers with us today. We are going to hear from Jessica Mahar, the New York Policy and Strategy Director at the Nature Conservancy. We have Jennifer Jones Austin, CEO and Executive Director of FPWA. And we have Barbara Ettington, Board of Director member and Chair of Special Events for the League of Women Voters of the City of New York. Now, before you hear from them, I have a very important role of introducing today's moderator, Madeline McCormick, who is ABNY's Membership and Events Manager. Now, some of you know her. She's been an integral part of the ABNY team for more than 4 years, but more importantly, she has been the one behind the scenes producing all of our ABNY events, most notably our Power Breakfast. So now it's time for me to bring her from behind the wizard's curtain into the spotlight to moderate today's panel. So with that, I turn the Zoom over to you, Madeline. Thank you.
Thank you, Melva. So let's jump right in. As Melva said, on November 8th, voters in New York City will vote on important ballot measures that will impact the city's ability to enforce human rights and improve funding for environmental protection. So over the next hour, you will hear from experts who will detail the ballot measures so that you can be a more informed voter when you go to the polls. Our first presenter will be Jessica Ottney Mahar. As Melva said, she is the Nature Conservancy's New York Policy and Strategy Director. She leads the Nature Conservancy's New York policy team and oversees conservation programs across the state. Jessica and her team have successfully advocated for the enactment of dozens of laws and regulations, including the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and helped secure billions of funding to protect and restore New York's natural resources and address global warming. She also leads statewide environmental coalitions with partners from labor, business, health, environmental justice, and conservation groups. Currently, she is leading the Vote Yes for Clean Water and Jobs Coalition and campaign in support of a $4.2 billion environmental bond measure, the largest in New York history. ABNY actively participates in this coalition, and our involvement dates back to its predecessor group of New Yorkers for Clean Water and Jobs. So ABNY can attest to the breadth and depth of the organizations involved in the alliance. This is a reminder to please submit questions for Jessica and the rest of the presenters in the Q&A function. and we will get to them at the end of the program. So I will now pass it on to Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you to everyone who's a part of ABNY. As Madeline said, the organization has been a part of the coalition that's working in support of the Bond Act for quite a while now. And we're so thrilled to have you and to be working with your organization and all of your members who are here today. Thank you so much for coming. So I'm here to talk about the Bond Act, the Environmental Bond Act. It'll be Prop 1 on your ballot. And I'll tell you a little bit about it and also more about how to vote this year. So this is a really amazing opportunity. It's the first time in a generation that New York voters will be able to support clean water and clean air and jobs, as it turns out, at the ballot. I'm really excited about it, and hopefully after today you will be too. The measure is really focused on protecting the natural resources we depend on, clean drinking water, clean air, and also improving conditions in communities across the state and bringing greater sustainability to our communities so that our kids and grandkids can grow up in a clean and prosperous state. So I'll share a little bit about what this measure will do. It really is focused on some key core programs, and they're aimed at protecting natural resources, as I said, and then also making sure that we can be a sustainable state and we can adapt to the extreme weather we're now seeing from climate change. So first and foremost, it'll help us safeguard clean water. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in this Bond Act that will be invested in drinking water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, and stormwater infrastructure. And I think we all really saw the devastation that happened recently, obviously with the hurricanes that have been happening in Puerto Rico, Florida, the Carolinas, but also here in New York. Earlier this year, we lost lives in Ida. And so we need to make sure that we're continuing to invest in the infrastructure that carries our clean water to our homes, takes dirty water away from our homes and businesses, and also deals with that storm water when all of the rain comes. This is a great opportunity for New York because there's a lot of federal money right now from the bipartisan infrastructure bill as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. And this Bond Act is really well tailored to leverage that funding and provide local match. So we're really excited about the opportunity to do that and bring more of that federal money into New York. The Bond Act will also help us with additional infrastructure, replacing things like lead pipes, which a lot of our homes, our homeowners, our residents are still drinking from, and making sure that our transportation infrastructure is suited to better handle water. I'm in upstate New York today, but all throughout the state, from New York City and Long Island to Albany and out to Buffalo, we have places where our roads intersect with water, streams, rivers, and they depend on culverts to carry that water underneath the road and make sure that during storms, those roads don't blow out. We know that as more water comes with a changing climate, we need to right size our bridges, our roads, our culverts, so that we can continue to have passable roads that withstand the tests of time. So this funding will also be invested in transportation infrastructure. And likewise, it'll be invested in improvements that help people's health and their safety. So thinking a lot about climate change, a lot of this so far has been about flooding, but also deadly heat is really plaguing our communities. And what we're learning is the communities that most experience heat, it's not even across even New York City or the state. In fact, a lot of our communities that have been the subject of disinvestment or redlining are really hotter during these deadly heat waves that are coming more and more often. This has been shown that they're lacking nature, they're lacking infrastructure that helps them stay cool. And so the Bond Act will help by investing in that kind of infrastructure. It'll also support energy efficiency improvements to state-owned facilities and renewable energy siting at those places, as well as support the purchase of clean school buses for school districts. And then finally, conserving natural resources that we depend on. Certainly at the Nature Conservancy, we care a lot about this, but all New Yorkers do. We saw New Yorkers flocking to parks and open spaces in the city and across the state during COVID. People really need access to nature for their health, for their solace. And we're finding that, employers and businesses want these amenities in the community for their employees. And so the Bond Act will help us expand recreational infrastructure, making sure that we have more parks and open places for all people, and also improve wildlife habitat and the green spaces, as well as local farms, so that we can have local food for our communities across the state. A couple of key things to note about this Bond Act. One is it'll create good jobs. AECOM did a study with Rebuild by Design, one of our partners, and found that this Bond Act will support nearly 100,000 family-sustaining jobs in New York, which is really exciting. And we're really grateful that the labor community has been a strong supporter of this measure with us. And then also the investment in disadvantaged communities. This Bond Act requires that at least 35 to 40% of the total funding be invested in disadvantaged communities, those that have been most harmed by pollution. And we're really excited to see that component of the state's climate law actualized and become real, come to life in this Bond Act. So we're making sure folks know how to vote. There's a lot of ways to vote now. You can get out, vote in person early, vote on election day. If you need an absentee ballot, you can get one. You can do all of that at the state site, the Board of Elections website. And you can also learn more about the Bond Act and take a pledge to vote on our website, which will get you reminders that it's coming up so you don't forget. That website's right here, voteyescleanwaterandjobs.com. And you can follow us on social media at NY Bond Act. You can share it with your friends, get the word out, and work with us to make sure that people remember to vote yes on these propositions, and don't forget to flip the ballot and make sure you vote all the way across or down your ballot this year. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over.
Thank you, Jessica. That was great. We'll get to the audience questions later. But for now, you talked about how 35% of the Bond Act funding would be allocated for communities that have been disproportionately impacted by climate change. Do you have any examples that you can provide on how the Bond Act can be implemented into these communities, and what might be the long-term impacts of the funding in those communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's actually funding specifically to reduce air and water pollution in environmental justice communities, for example. And these are places where we've seen a significant amount of pollution. Oftentimes polluting facilities are sited in these communities. And so this funding can be used to provide new technology, for example, to a polluting facility, so it's no longer polluting the air. There's also funding in the Bond Act for things like urban forestry or cooling centers to be located in communities. And so, as I said, what we found in our cities across the state, including in New York City, is that the way things like the urban forest is distributed in New York City is that communities with less means have less nature. And that actually means they get hotter, a lot hotter during heat waves. And these are also often places where people are suffering most from things like cardiovascular illnesses or asthma. And so the more we can do to mitigate that heat means less people will become ill or die during heat waves. And so the funding for the Bond Act will be able to increase urban forestry, put in cooling roofs or green roofs, and also put in cooling centers and make sure people who don't have access to, for example, air conditioning, have a place to go during these deadly heat waves.
That's great. Thank you. So we will now move on to Jennifer Jones-Austin in the racial justice ballot measures. And just a reminder to continue to put questions in the Q&A function for the end of the program. So Jennifer Jones-Austin is an ABNY friend who has participated in a variety of ABNY initiatives and events. She is the CEO and executive director of ABNY, an anti-poverty policy and advocacy organization with 170 member agencies and faith partners. She has led and secured monumental changes in social policy to strengthen and empower disenfranchised and marginalized. She has a profound understanding of the link between race, poverty, law, and social policy in America and the role religion plays. Jennifer also chairs the NYC Racial Justice Commission, the first of its kind in the nation, created to develop ballot proposals to revise the city's charter to dismantle structural racism in government functions and ensure equity for Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color. So with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Earlier today, we were saying that we're still learning how to work Zoom, and we were talking about always talking while the mute button is on, and so I just did that. I just first want to thank CEO Melva Miller and all of ABNY for this opportunity to present information to all of you about the racial equity ballot measures that you'll all have an opportunity to learn more about and vote on come election time this fall. And I also want to express my appreciation to Jessica Ottney Mahar for the work that she's doing and all that she explained about the environmental bond that is before us to the proposal. What they're doing there is seeking to provide clean air and and jobs, green jobs, clean water for everybody. And we're seeking to do the same thing as a member of the Racial Justice Commission. The Racial Justice Commission is seeking to do the same thing for all New Yorkers with respect to everything, including cleaner environments. We're looking at how New York City, much like the nation, has for not just decades, but centuries, essentially put forward and held up racial injustice and inequity in our foundational laws. We all find ourselves living in a society that was birthed, we can't deny it, birthed in racism, beginning with the United States Constitution that said that persons of African descent were 3/5 of a person. That is racism in structures, and it has held up through the years. Whether we look at redlining, the GI, we look at what happened with school segregation, housing segregation. Racism has persisted in our society. Policing, the list can go on and on and on. What I want everybody to appreciate is that racism pervades every pillar of our society, and we're all affected by it. And what our former mayor, Bill de Blasio, did in 2021, as we continue to see COVID rage through New York City and to see its disproportionate impact on people of color, what he appreciated was that when we looked at what was happening in our communities of color and why Black and brown persons were, disproportionately and devastatingly impacted by COVID, as we also were seeing what was happening with respect to policing and excessive use of force, he said, we've got to appreciate once and for all as a city and as a nation that racism is in our business. It's what we do, it's how we live. Even if we're good people, we're somehow affected by it. And we've all got to lean in and be more active in taking on an anti-racist approach to law enforcement, to lawmaking, to just how we deliver goods and services. And so he established the Racial Justice Commission, comprised of 11 commissioners, all New Yorkers, all from around New York City, the 5 boroughs, to come in and take a look at structural racism as it's embedded in New York's foundational laws, the New York City Charter. Again, we're not saying that each and every New Yorker is a racist. That's not what's happening here at all. What we're saying is that we live in a society that has systems and structures that are inherently racist. And if we are to begin to ensure that we are a society where racism is not what governs the day, but rather equity and justice for all, we've got to look at our charter, the foundational laws, we function as a city and do something about it. So I'm a member of the commission, an individual who's running poverty in New York City and around the nation go hand in hand. But I'm also an individual here in New York City personally will be voting for these proposals because I believe that they have the opportunity to begin to dismantle structural racism and uphold a just and equitable city for all New Yorkers. Now, I'm not telling people how to vote. I'm just here for a decision. So I'm going to put on my screen and share with you the proposals to give you a good sense as to what they're all about. Again, as I was sharing with you, the mayor created these, Mayor de Blasio created the commission back in March, and the commission met with New Yorkers for about 6 or 7 months, even though it was COVID. We met with more than 3,000 New Yorkers, persons who had lived experience about, where they saw or experienced racism in their communities, whether it was everything from garbage not being picked up to to housing, water and heat problems that were tied in with government, to not having equitable access to public transportation, or to quality hospitals, quality education. We heard from them about challenges that they experienced in government in getting jobs, wage and occupation segregation. Even though there are laws on the books that say that people should be paid fair and equitably, we heard a lot about people of color and women not receiving pay parity, as well as not being, given opportunities to move up in government structures. We heard a lot about the injustices and the inequities that pervade our city. And so we came together, also talked with thought leaders from around the country about the equity work that they've been doing. We talked with Republicans and Democrats. This was a nonpartisan effort. And ultimately, what we determined was that we needed to begin to develop a foundation for dismantling structural racism in government functioning. Again, appreciating that racism is embedded in our structural laws, we needed to figure out how to begin to dismantle that. And so we put forth 3 proposals. And the proposals are intended to, again, begin the process of dismantling structural racism. They take an overarching approach to doing so. The first proposal would establish a statement of values to guide government. When we looked at the New York City Charter, which is the Constitution, we realized that New York does not have a preamble in its charter. Essentially a statement of values that guide government in how it should engage with its residents, how it should think about what everybody's entitled to. And so we determined that we should create a statement of values and add a vision that centers on justice, equity for everybody here in New York City. We realized that in order to do that, we first had to acknowledge some of the harms that have presented for people in communities of color, beginning with the Lenape people and the taking of their land. Because the truth of the matter is that you can't really fix and address a problem if you first don't acknowledge it and own it. So that's what this preamble does. It recognizes that we're a great city, but we too have got some work to do. And one of the ways that we can do it is by beginning to see everybody as having a right to quality housing, quality education, a safe environment, clean air, etc. And so the preamble is intended to guide the city government in fulfilling the duties to provide a more just and equitable city for everybody. I want to mention here that it does not create a private right of action. It's just a statement to begin to guide New York City to ensure a just and equitable city for all. The second ballot question would establish a racial equity office, a racial equity plan, and a commission, all to hold New York City government accountable for driving towards equity and a just city for everybody. This racial equity office would live essentially in perpetuity. Our new mayor, Mayor Adams, has established an office of equity. He's done so by executive order because that's what his powers allow. Establishing a racial equity office in the charter would essentially make it something that is undoable. And we know that if we've lived with structural racism for 400 years, we're not going to just, erase it in one mayor's term, in one term for a mayor or 2 terms. We've got to keep at this. we've got to stay with it. And so we want to establish, the commission decided that it would be good to establish in perpetuity through the charter a racial equity office that would be responsible for every 2 years developing a citywide racial equity plan that would also bring in other intersectionalities, gender, sexual orientation, identity, immigration, just looking at how people may be marginalized and oppressed, and working towards developing policies, programs, looking at fiscal policy, and making sure that the plan is implementable. That first it looks at key social indicators, economic indicators, to make sure the city is moving in the right direction, but then it's an implementable plan. The plan then would be reported, published every 2 years, and we'd look at whether or not the city is meeting the objectives of that plan. There'd be a complementing commission comprised of everyday New Yorkers, many with lived experience, to help, be that checks and balances, but also to work with government to make sure that the plans have teeth and they have real meaning, and that they are, that they actually are achieving the goals, not just in design, not just in implementation, but also in impact. The third proposal is something that people often get quite excited about when they hear about it. This proposal would establish that New York, the government, annually report the true cost of living. Now, what makes this different and unusual is that all of America, essentially, when we look at the cost of living, we look to the federal poverty level, which is really an outdated, antiquated measure of what it costs to live. The federal poverty level says that a family of four living anywhere in America needs just $27,750 to technically not be poor. But we know that here in New York City, according to the self-sufficiency standard, a family of four living in the Bronx needs at least $100,000. What does that mean? That means that family, if we're basing wages, if we're looking at wages or income supports, and we're basing them off of a federal poverty level, we know that that family really in the Bronx isn't living with dignity. Because if wages and income supports are set at $27,750, that's a big gap between that and ours. We want to make sure that all New Yorkers live with dignity. And so the commission determined that one way of doing that is to begin to establish what this true cost. Again, it doesn't the city, but again, it helps to inform and shape not just values, but then policies, systems, and structures where we can lean in and help all New Yorkers to get to a more dignified, equitable way of living. So I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I just want to inform you. I want you to know what the commission believed that these proposals would do if they are actually voted upon and passed. And I want you to know that as a New Yorker, I believe in this because I know that this nation, this city for far too long has been spending more money than is necessary to keep unjust structures and systems in place and always trying to catch up. But here in New York City, for the first time in the nation, we've got racial justice proposals on the ballot. And New York can be the game changer if we determine to in making equity a core part, a core function of government. Like the same with the environmental bond proposal, you're going to be able to vote in beginning with early voting, October 29th, and then on November 8th for these proposals. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all that information, Jennifer. This is a great presentation. Can you talk a little bit about the role that community-based organizations can play as an accountability partner to ensure that the Racial Justice Commission sees all of those commitments through?
Absolutely. So here in New York City, our community-based organizations play a vital role alongside government in ensuring that people who've long been marginalized and oppressed have access to basic critical resources to help them, survive in this city. These community-based organizations are critical even when these proposals pass, if they do pass, because they'll be able to be that immediate, that direct on-the-ground pulse for seeing whether or not these proposals really do have the impact that they are intended to have. They will be the ones who are helping to ensure that the indicators that are used to determine what equity looks like, that they are the right indicators and that they really do speak to what people experience, what they need on a daily basis. Community-based organizations are critical. Additionally, community-based organizations will be able to help us appreciate whether or not the resources that New York City, the significant resources that New York City is already applying to address the inequities that persist, whether or not they are being used in the most efficient ways, the most effective ways to bring about greater opportunity for all New Yorkers.
Awesome, thank you. So now we're going to turn it over to Barb Eddington to dive into the importance of civic engagement and to present you with some additional voter information. So
Thank you.
Barb Eddington began volunteering for the League of Women Voters of the City of New York in 2014. As an all-volunteer run organization, she contributes her time and energy in many ways. She currently serves as the board director and chair of special events and previously has chaired the Voter Services Committee. Additionally, after a career in corporate and hospital marketing, Barbara founded her own marketing agency in 2004, serving nonprofits primarily in healthcare. So I will now turn it over to Barb.
Thank you so much. And thank you to ABNY for including us in this presentation and welcoming us as a new member of ABNY. The League of Women Voters has been in New York City for over 100 years, fighting our nonpartisan fight for voting rights. And yes, we are an all-volunteer-led organization. I've been asked to talk about some voting basics, and I know we've addressed voting a few times in our previous speakers. But first, I did want to talk about voter turnout in New York City. 90% of eligible New Yorkers are actually registered to vote. That is a big number. That's the good news. The bad news is it starts falling off from there. In the last presidential election in 2020, 62% of New Yorkers came out to vote, compared to 67% in the United States, which was a record turnout in recent history. In our midterms, 2018, 40% of New Yorkers came out, compared to 53% in the US. We did better in our local elections. Usually about 20% come out for local elections across the country. In ours, we had over 26% come out for citywide primary. And then that dropped to 23% in the general. We think that the ranked choice voting introduced had a big impact on bringing some voters out, but it's still a big gap between those who are eligible to vote and those who actually turn out to vote. So we often ask, why aren't you voting? We hear, I'm too busy, I can't take the time off, or politics doesn't affect my life. I don't like any of the candidates, they're all crooks, or my vote doesn't matter. The League has been fighting against a lot of these barriers, and we've had a few good wins, like introducing early voting with longer hours. We're also very proud of supporting ranked choice voting and the New York Voters' Rights Act. We've had some losses. Last year, if you recall, there were 3 ballot proposals for voting reform. Again, last year was a very low voter turnout. One of the proposals that we were really advocating for was same-day election day registration. That would give voters more time to register to vote, and we think that that would really impact the youth voter segment. All 3 voting reforms failed across statewide, but they were passed. They did find a majority in New York City. Politics doesn't affect my life. Well, actually, it affects almost everything outside of your home, from the air you breathe to the water you drink, as we've heard today on the ballot proposal. Elected officials want to be reelected. So the decisions they make will be tending to give priority to those populations that vote. For instance, if there's a budget cut for road repair or garbage pickup or whatever it is, guess which neighborhoods get that attention? I don't like any of the candidates. Does that mean you shouldn't vote? Of course not. You should vote. You have the right to vote, and many people fought ahead of you to give you that right. In fact, many died for that right. But we recommend that you look for the candidate that stands up for the issues that stands up for more of the issues that you care about. And I always love this sign. You can't fix stupid, but you can vote it out. My vote doesn't matter. Well, in our primary last year, Mr. Adams held out 8,400 vote lead over Catherine Garcia. That represented a single percentage point in New York City. Your vote does matter. When you do not vote, someone else is deciding for you. So the voting basics, here's some websites that can help you get to what the forms you need. Vote.nyc is the New York City Board of Elections. nycvotes.org is the New York Campaign Finance Board, and that of course links to Board of Elections. It also links to TurboVote, and it provides a good reports on voter turnout. And of course, our website, lwvnyc.org, provides links to all those forms as well. And we give you toolkits on how to register people to vote. Our voter guide at vote411.org will be up soon. So basics in your plan to vote. Is your registration up to date? New Yorkers move a lot. If you've moved, yes, you have to update your registration. You can still go to your new polling place if you haven't changed it, but you will be filling out an affidavit ballot, which is basically updating your voter registration. Last day to do that is October 14. Who's on the ballot this year? We've got a lot up. We've got federal seats, U.S. Senate, and a lot of congressional races. Our statewide governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, comptroller. These will all appear in the voter guides coming up on New York City Votes and our Vote 411. All New York State Assembly seats are open and Senate seats are up. And then we get into the judges. How do we find out about the judges? This is something we've been working on to try to get more transparency for that. We do find that there is some information on Ballotpedia, New York Judicial Elections. You can look up your particular ballot at any of those websites I've given you before, and they will be different depending on your district, obviously. Early voting and polling places, they're different for early voting than they are for election day. Early voting begins October 29. You can look up your polling site. And we recommend that once you find your polling site, why don't you post it in your apartment building so all your neighbors know where the polling site is. Absentee ballot this year, you may not vote in person for your absentee if you have chosen to apply for an absentee ballot. If you do go to your poll and you want to vote in person, you will be filling out an affidavit ballot, but you can deliver your absentee ballot to any poll site in the city. Deadline to request, October 24. So here are the websites again. And we ask you to vote louder. Encourage 3 more people to vote, whether it's reminding them, whether it's helping them fill out an absentee application, and everyone you talk to, certainly tell them to flip the ballot this year because there are proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. That was great. I know you discussed a lot about voter turnout in New York City. And as New York City turns the corner and moves into a post-pandemic recovery, do you think that that will have a positive impact on voter engagement, or is low voter turnout indicative of a trend to stay?
Low voter turnout seems to be the thing in New York City. But I do believe that as we are going through the pandemic and coming out, that we're hopeful, and we're going to be watching our elected officials making, the right decisions, and we're going to be holding them more accountable. So I do believe that that will have an impact on voter turnout as they try to hold them accountable. We also strongly believe that for local elections, the ranked choice voting has had a nice impact on voter turnout.
That's great. And this is just a reminder to submit your questions for all of the panelists in the Q&A function. We will ask Jennifer and Jessica to come back on the screen, and we will go through some more questions. So let me just give them a minute to rejoin. In the meantime, Barb, we can go to another question for you. Nonprofits are constrained on how they engage in public education on civic engagement issues. Many are avoiding lobbying and partisan activity because they could affect their exempt status. How can nonprofits and other nonpartisan entities encourage civic engagement while maintaining the principles of impartiality and neutrality this election season and beyond?
Wow, thank you. That's a great question. The League of Women Voters is a nonprofit. We are a 501c3. We do lobby. We also advocate. We have all volunteers. So in doing that, that does not affect the measurement because it's measured in dollars and we have volunteer hours. But that's to say, nonprofits can certainly advocate for issues that impact their nonprofit. Every nonprofit has an issue that they're looking at. So we would strongly recommend that they help educate their constituents on what level of government impacts their issues so that they know, is it a federal, state, or local legislation that might impact it, and then help them understand the impact of their voting or non-voting for officials who are supporting their mission or not. We've also found for-profits are pushing back on considering voter registration a partisan thing. We do partner with a lot of corporations who are helping by merely reminding people of election dates coming up and helping them remind of deadlines for voter registration. So all of that can be helpful.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to go back to Jessica. Jessica, you talked about the impacts of hurricanes a little bit, and we're seeing that in Florida, and New Yorkers saw it after Hurricane Ida, when the storm killed at least 43 people in the Northeast region and more than 150,000 homes experienced water damage, property loss, and were without power. If the Bond Act is approved by New York State voters, the $4.2 billion will be invested into New York State environment. What are some of the long-term environmental impacts that this funding will have on New York City specifically, and what are some priorities for other areas of the state?
Great, thanks. Yeah, and it's tremendous the amount of work that's needed both in the city and around the state to make sure that we are prepared for what climate change is bringing us, both in the form of more water and more heat, and also threatening, frankly, our food supply. So the Bond Act is really aimed at steering into these issues. And also leveraging, again, federal funding that's now available both through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. So obviously, investments in our water infrastructure and making sure that, we see them all over the state: water mains breaking, sinkholes swallowing cars, bungling up traffic. We see this happening in New York City in every borough, and we see it happening in upstate New York and on Long Island. So this funding will help us repair that water infrastructure. Right now, across New York State, the Department of Environmental Conservation and Department of Health estimate that between drinking water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure, which are our sewers, we need about $80 billion worth of investment. And everyone's going, but wait, this is only $4 billion. It's not something that you can do in one foul swoop, but what it can do is start down a pathway and then leveraging other funding. So that'll be one thing. Another that I already talked about is reducing the pollution that causes climate change and also causes dirty air. So things like purchasing electric school buses and school bus fleets across the state, investing in making our state-owned facilities more energy efficient, and also our school buildings. So New York State is a tremendous property owner across the state. And so those are places where we can readily do things like site renewable energy, and you're not doing things like causing conflict because there's already development on that site. Places like our very large SUNY campuses. We can also site things on rooftops of public buildings, SUNY and CUNY facilities, and we can make sure our schools have energy efficient systems, which this is also a benefit, a co-benefit that we learned about during COVID, is that when you do those improvements for energy efficiency, you can oftentimes create cleaner air and the ability to filter air, which is important, as we learned with going back to school and communicable diseases. And we're also going to be able to conserve more. I know there's big campaigns in New York City to create more parks, to invest in our parks, to protect nature in the city for people. That's something that people all across the state want to see. And so, there's specific funding for investing in that. And then finally, our local farms, we're losing farms every single day in New York. And these are farms that bring fresh food into the farmers markets and into places right in New York City, into our amazing restaurants. And so we want to make sure that we can keep our farms farming and providing fresh food into our communities. And the Bond Act will help with that.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so let's go back to Jennifer. We have a question, and the question is, the city-wide racial justice ballot proposals were informed by New York's residents, and the commission also engaged scholars and experts from New York City. So what immediate benefits will these proposals yield for New Yorkers if they are approved? So what are the immediate impacts?
So I came off of mute and looked like I came right back on. I think I'm unmuting myself and then I'm getting muted. Thanks. So the first thing that I think is important to appreciate is that the hope and desire is that we will begin to change values, attitudes, and beliefs, that in city government, that government officials, not suggesting in the least bit that people are coming into work with a racist mindset, not at all, but the way that our systems have been structured. Very often policies are being made without an appreciation for how they impact certain communities. If you take, for example, all that Jessica has shared concerning environment and climate, we know that here in New York City, we know that in other parts of the country, that often people who are challenged and compromised the most, or disproportionately so, by the impact of climate change, are disproportionately low-income people and people of color. And so the aim here is, first and foremost, if these proposals would pass, that we begin as a city to look very intentionally at how, existing policies and practices work to disadvantage people in communities of color. And so we will look at everything from how our education system, is structured in such a way that maybe we do not have the highest quality of teachers or educators or school buildings in certain communities. We'll look at pollution and sanitation and what is happening on a day-to-day basis in communities that are lower income with respect to, like sanitation and pickup and how certain pollutants, how certain, certain products will stay in certain communities in the air and affect the quality of air. So the intention here is that on day one, if these proposals would pass, then New York City government will begin looking with intentionality and sincerity at how to ensure that on a going forward basis, we affect new policies, new programs, new ways of doing business that even the playing field. We'll look at government contracting and, who has access to capital, who has access to be able to, be in the game and compete for contracts for critical services, whether they be financial, like asset management in nature, or whether they just simply are, procurement of services to run a privatized sanitation pickup, things of that nature. And so the belief here is that if we look with intention, as these proposals would allow, we're then going to set new policy that can have immediate impact, but also long-term impact. One of the most immediate impacts would likely be seen with the true cost of living measure, because we will have then an appreciation for what are the gaps between what New Yorkers are making, what they're receiving by way of income supports. Should they need a childcare subsidy? Should they need a transportation subsidy? What is the gap? And, and what is that costing? Not just New York, but everyday citizens in trying to make ends meet.
Thank you. We have another question for Jessica. In the Bond Act, it is estimated that 84,000 jobs will be created. What impact is that going to have on New York City's middle class and the broader economy?
Yeah, so we were really excited that AECOM and Rebuild by Design, two partners, Rebuild is in our coalition, and AECOM, worked with them to produce this study to quantify the job creation potential of the measure. And I'll just say it was done before the bipartisan infrastructure bill was even being talked about and obviously passed, and it was done before the legislature added a bit more to the Bond Act. So I think the 84,000 figure is most likely on the low end of the potential here, because the leveraging opportunity is so incredible now with, again, that federal funding. We're really in this amazing once in a generation moment for funding and the opportunity it provides us. But, through the negotiation with the legislature this year, leading up to the Bond Act being authorized as part of the state budget, there was a lot of work done by allies in the labor sector to include provisions in this Bond Act that I think are the first time this has been done in a state bond measure. And so it's this is an amazing bond measure because it's large, because it's focused on these critical issues, because of the environmental justice lens, and because of the labor provisions. And so these jobs are in a diversity of sectors, but because the Bond Act is focused on, capital projects and significant infrastructure, a lot of these jobs are going to be, good paying jobs. They're going to be on a career path. They're going to be jobs that include things like apprenticeship programs and benefits for the workers. So, this is the kind of work that we want to make sure people are able to do in the environment as we're building a sustainable future for our state and for our city. We want to make sure that the people doing it are making a living and a good living doing it. So we're really excited by the opportunity that this Bond Act creates, obviously for environmental protection at the Nature Conservancy, but also for the transformational pieces of this bond measure that will really create additional impacts in communities and increase quality of life.
May I just jump in here and say that, I'm excited to hear how all of this really ties together. The racial justice ballot measures are the first of their kind, not just in New York City, but in the nation. Nowhere in the nation has there ever been a vote by the people on whether or not they want to see greater equity and justice. Like a more just way of living, everybody having real opportunity and access. And that's what I'm also hearing with respect to the bond that is being put forward and the proposal with respect to environment. It's this, we're at a place and a point in time in our nation where if we are sincere about opportunity for everybody and addressing some of the harms that we haven't created, but we've lived into, we have an opportunity to do something about it. Now, again, I'm just talking to you as a New Yorker, like I have my racial justice hat and commission hat, and I have my FPW hat. I'm not telling you how to vote. I'm just telling you that, this is what these proposals are intended to do, to bring about that greater, that leaning in. We've been looking at what's been happening for the last 2-3 years with COVID. We've been looking for years at what's been happening with climate. What we're seeking to do here is to try to begin to affect change, real and meaningful change for all New Yorkers. And so that's what these proposals, all 4 of them, are designed to do.
Thank you. So just to close out the questions, a question for all of you. What advice would you give to the ABNY network who are looking to engage their own networks around the ballot measures? Anyone can jump in here.
Well, I can reiterate that every ABNY member has a huge following with their employees, with their constituents, with their employees' families, and getting the word out about voting is huge. It's just as simple as reminding, or as involved as saying, what are your issues? And just reminding everybody to flip the ballot this year, that people don't remember to do that. That's huge.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and say that I've been saying to people of late, flip it or you'll miss it, right? If you don't flip it, you're going to miss it. I think that, what is important for ABNY members to know and communicate with all of their constituents and the people with whom they engage is that what we've got here is an opportunity for New York to take action, in many ways to be the first in the nation to take action on issues that have been deemed critical for all of America. And so, New York often leads. This is an opportunity to lean in and decide whether or not we want to lead here too. It's a choice, and the choice is for New Yorkers to make, but they've got to be informed. And so I think this is a real opportunity for ABNY to help inform New Yorkers about what's out here and what the possibilities are. So just, telling people to lean into the webinar, flip it or you'll miss it. And, they can Google and find out more information about these proposals and deepen their knowledge.
It's hard to add much to what these two brilliant women have said already. Certainly, we are worried about folks forgetting to flip their ballots. So again, reminding everyone to do that is critical. And on the Bond Act, this is an opportunity once in a generation to vote yes for clean water and clean air in our communities. And so it's a good news story. Elections can often give people heartburn. We want to make sure they get out there and vote and make sure that they vote on the Environmental Bond Act this November.
Awesome. Thank you. So thank you, Jessica, Jennifer, and Barb for all of this information that will make us more informed voters on November 8th. To close out the program, I'm now going to turn it over to Aaron Sanders, ABNY's Director of Public Policy.
Thank you, Madeline. Good morning, everyone. Over the last hour, we heard from three dynamic experts about the importance of civic engagement. To close, I urge you all to participate in the election season that's forthcoming. And I will identify 3 ways that you can immediately get involved, 3 practical steps. First, you can encourage your networks to learn more about the ballot initiatives to make educated decisions at the polls. And you can also provide your networks with relevant information and resources. The city and statewide ballot initiatives will have a generational impact on New York City communities. As leaders within your communities and organizations, you are trusted to provide your networks with robust information regarding civic engagement. In your personal capacity, you can make your voice heard by reaching out to your friends, families, and colleagues. In your professional capacity, you can educate your clients, coworkers, organizational partners about the importance of these 4 ballot measures. Corporate and community awareness raising are great methods to increase electoral participation, and it's also a great way to energize voters. A second way you can get involved is by amplifying what you heard today on social media. Social media is an effective forum to highlight these 4 ballot measures. The Racial Justice Commission and the Clean Water and Jobs Coalition have ample materials that you can use to amplify online. You can also add your own voice to the conversation. Specifically, you can use your social media platform to encourage people to register to vote. To reiterate, social media is vitally important. It's a great way to reach young adults who are first-time voters and want to be involved in the electoral process. Without ample awareness raisins, voters cannot make informed decisions at the polls. To close, you can also support existing organizations that are on the ground doing the work. In New York City, there are many GOTV-oriented organizations that are galvanizing and mobilizing voters. ABNY participates in nonpartisan, impartial voter education, and you can also do this work without getting involved in partisan politics. Phone banking, text banking, and voter registration drives are practical, easy ways that you can get involved and insert your voice into the conversation. ABNY is currently working with partners to promote nonpartisan volunteer opportunities, and we will share those opportunities with you soon. In closing, your outreach can make New York City a better place for all, specifically those who live here, those who work here, and others who visit our great city. Thank you.